Hey everyone, thanks for joining. I'm stoked to be here. I was at the Wild Labs launch event, a long time ago, and so it's really amazing to see how far this community's come and everything that's come out of it. Some folks here have heard of FieldKit and know what we do, but I wanted to talk a little bit about things that we've learned along the way under the context of scaling a project. So I've been doing research in conservation tech for about 15 years now. I started an organization before called Conservify that was like a conservation tech prototyping lab, basically. It was a lot of fun, built a lot of projects with partners. But during that time, there was a lot of, we would get these constant requests for sensors, because I'm sure a lot of you guys know, sensors traditionally are expensive, hard to use, they don't play well together, and there's a bunch of bigger issues around it, and so that's sort of where FieldKit came from. We're based in Los Angeles. This is the lab that we work out of. It's where all our inventory lives, where the prototyping happens. It was Conservify, and it transitioned to FieldKit when I decided that this is the path forward for us. So FieldKit is a nonprofit. Our mission is really focused on making environmental sensing easier for everyone, and we go about that a bunch of different ways. We typically have two major pathways that we go through that. One is we build the tools. That's the hardware and software tools required to do that sort of work. And then the second is around capacity building, which I'll talk a little bit more, but it's sort of, okay, now you have the sensors. What are your questions? Where do you put them? How do you maintain them? What does calibration mean? And all of the sort of the technical knowledge behind that a lot of folks don't necessarily have as they're moving through these sorts of things. And so the FieldKit platform really is three different things. We have a hardware, a bunch of different hardware. I'll just briefly explain it before I get into the scale stuff. An app and a website. And our mission is really how do we drive down the costs? How do we make things easier to use? How can we bring all that stuff to scientific tools, which isn't something that scientific tools typically have. So we build a lot of hardware. We build a data logger, a bunch of different sensor modules measuring things like flooding, water quality, weather, all sorts of stuff like that. And it's all open source. And so the idea is that we built this framework. We have people now who are building their own sensor modules, and we're hoping to build out an ecosystem of hardware to do environmental monitoring. We've even developed versions of these that can be used in other environments. This is a project we had with Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute to build basically an underwater field kit. And we're looking to create a product out of that this year. So this one that you see up on the screen is still a prototype. We also have an app. So basically the whole point of the app is you can talk to the sensors, configure things, download data, run calibrations, view live data, all that sort of stuff. Also free to use for anybody, and a data visualization portal, which we sort of like to consider more of a data conversation portal, because it's really built around sharing data views and commenting and exploring that sort of data. Every bit of this is open source and it's modular, so folks can use certain pieces of it. For example, our data portal is being used by the city of New York to do flood monitoring, and they have integrated other sensors into the system as well. And then the capacity building part is what we call field schools. What we found from putting these tools out a lot is that a lot of folks knew they wanted this data, and they had deep questions about what was happening in their environment, but all of the technical side of it, where's the best place to put a sensor? How do you maintain this thing so that it gives you good data? How often do you have to calibrate it? All those sorts of things was information that traditionally is not very easy to find. And so we built an education system around that, and we do trainings, and we publish stuff online for people to use. The whole idea behind my organization is get this information out there so it's not a hidden talent anymore. So over the years, we've kind of gone through this process of designing and building the hardware, thinking through different models, and I would say really over the last 2 years, we've been focusing on how to scale, what does financial sustainability mean beyond just philanthropic funding, and so hopefully, some of the projects out here in the audience today can learn from what we've learned, so that you can go from that prototype into something that survives and grows. The first thing is, a lot of people think about pilots and prototypes as products. They're very different things. Pilots and prototypes are exciting. There are situations where you can just brute force success out of them. that is not a product, you know? And it also doesn't translate into sort of a sustainable approach forward. It's a totally different skill set, and it's one that is like, you know, there's a lot of people who are really good at it, and it's something you have to think about early, not just when you run out of funds and you try and figure out ways to bring money in. So scaling is sort of like this sequence of different gates you have to think about. Most people like overinvest in the phase 1 here, and then they sort of just underinvest in phases 2 through 4. So I'll talk a little bit about our journey with that lens, so you can learn something from us. This talk also focuses a lot on hardware, because I'm a hardware guy. And so hardware is hard. Scaling looks different than if you're scaling a software product, so sort of keep that in mind as we're talking about this thing. So, you know, scientific tools traditionally were created in a way that just doesn't work for scaling. You know, it comes out of an academic research lab. They're not thinking about scale. They're thinking about, you know, number of decimal points and capabilities and all that sort of stuff. You can't just turn around and take that and try and sell it to people and have something that people really want to use. They're typically expensive. They're typically hard to use, hard to repair, not really flexible. Now, consumer electronics is very different, right? Like, they think about things from the design standpoint in a completely different mindset. And I think that's something where conservation technology can actually learn quite a bit from. So the very first thing you have to do is you really need to understand the problem and who your users are. This is very important. And users are a group of people than the buyers, who are a different group of people than the funders. So all of those people are important in the sustainability of your project, and you really got to think about that. A lot of times people cast a wide net and hope for the best, and that's not really the way to do it. We found that like finding a real good wedge case that you can learn so much from is super critical, and try and scale before you're trying to do everything for everyone. When we started FieldKit, we tried that. We tried to do everything for everyone. We're like, FieldKit will be used by citizen scientists and environmental justice and conservation and field science and education, and all that stuff together was just too much. It made a situation where it was hard for us to kind of learn and adapt. So doing proper user research is super critical. It's not something that engineers really like to do very often, but it helps you to understand what you're building and why you're building it. Before I built FieldKit, I went to the field with maybe like 40 different field scientists and conservationists and watched them deploy sensors to really understand the things that they hated about it, what was difficult, what worked, what didn't, and all that stuff really informed what we wanted to build. Also, it's important to reach out broadly. We did that through like qualitative and quantitative methods. We did interviews. I interviewed over 50 people. And those are people who are, you know, potential users, they're experts in the field, they're people who started other organizations similar to what I want to do, and funders and all sorts of stuff just to really understand the space, and then did surveys just to see like, okay, what kind of features do people care about, what should our pipeline look like, and all of that. And then from all that information, there's a tool called user personas that happens a lot. This really is you're taking that everything you learned from all of that and trying to create these sort of like fake categories of people. And the good thing about doing these personas is that they become a reference point for as you're designing the product, so that you're constantly thinking about, what do I need to do right? What's the wrong way to do it? What do these people actually care about? What are their capabilities? All that sort of stuff. And then I found in this stage too, it's really great to form those like partnerships with early adopters. Early adopters for conservation technology are so important. These like are people that you can find that deeply believe in what you're trying to do, and that you can end up like building your product in a way that like helps to serve it. And there's wrong early adopters and there's right early adopters. There's people who request a lot, and there's people who can really be part of that product development process from the very start. So the next phase is where I think a lot of folks in the wildlife community spend a lot of time in, and that's in the prototyping side of things. So prototyping and piloting are the exciting parts of this job, but you should really think about what goes on beyond there. I can give so many pieces of advice about prototyping that I've learned over the years. Some really important ones is you have to be able to prototype your device somewhere close to where you live. Like if you live in the US and you want to build something for sub-Saharan Africa, you can't just always prototype it out there. You're going to fail, it's going to cost a lot of money, and you're going to have a lot of issues. The other thing is you're going to come into this because you know a lot about this with like things that you care about. You have to be ready to kill your darlings. You have to be ready to get rid of things that don't matter. And when you're thinking about a prototype, you have to think beyond just what is the piece of hardware. Where does that data live? How do people use it? All that sort of thing. One thing we always do with FieldKit is we never bring in new, shiny technologies because we always want to be kind of downstream of the innovation ecosystem that's happening more broadly in engineering. And we did a bunch of user testing. We actually even just paid random people off the street to use FieldKit, and we put it in front of them and didn't tell them anything about it, and just watched what they do, and learned so much from it. It was a super important part of the process. The next really important phase, and this is a completely different skill set, is basically the product design side. So this is things like designing for manufacturing, understanding all the things downstream. How do you think about scale and reliability and everything there? So the difference between a pilot and a prototype and a product is you have to be repeatable and reliable, right? You have to think about the things that really take your technology to that point. When we first built FieldKit, we were doing a lot. We were building a data logger, sensor platforms, an app, a website. That's a huge amount of work. If I were doing it again, I probably would have focused that a little bit more and done something smaller to start. But things like firmware should be boring. You should think about redundancy and reliability. Really something that you can kind of learn from. For scientific tools, validation is critically important. These things have to work, and you have to prove that they work. And so we've been running these co-deployments for years, these studies internally, and then we've also been working with universities and stuff and just saying, hey, can we deploy a FieldKit next to your weather stations and all this sort of stuff and work with you to publish some of that data. We spoke about it at AGU and places like that, but it's really important to show that you're building something that works, and it works as good as the other folks' stuff. The next phase really is thinking about the operational side of things, and this is also an area which engineers typically do not love, but it's incredibly important. With FieldKit, we struggled a lot, really, until I brought in a project manager, and she whipped us into shape, got us going forward, and it was just really, really, really incredible. I think a lot of times with projects like this, you're so passionate about it, and you're just trying to figure things out, and budgets are tight, and so you're trying to do everything yourself. You're trying to design the hardware, write the software, do the project management, do the outreach, and all this sort of stuff, and that's really not a recipe for something sustainable beyond a year, 2 years, or something like that. So being able to bring in the right people to help you through this is a huge and very important thing to do. And this work, as you move from this prototype into something that people can get and that can scale, takes a lot of different skill sets. It's really important to understand what's outside of your wheelhouse and how to bring in those right people. So I'll give you an example. We were building hardware during COVID, and we got hit by the supply chain. It was absolutely brutal. And so instead of trying to be ahead of it and try and figure it out, we just turned to our network and we tried to find some folks who can end up helping us. And Spark Fund, the organization Spark Fund, actually came in and they helped us really think through supply chain planning, how do you set things up, and they still help us to this day. And it's been really amazing because they can do a lot more than what my small team could ever do. This organizational stuff will create a culture shift in your organization, and that's a good thing because it will take you away from the sort of Wild West, let's build a prototype, let's take it out in the field, and let's see what happens from it, into something where okay, so let's think about how we can make this in a way that other people can use it, other people can build it, other people can maintain it, and that it doesn't require so much from our team to be able to do that. But it's a huge process to try and set up these sorts of things, particularly depending on whatever your model is. I'll talk a little bit about business models. I won't go super deep into it, but just thinking about what sort of systems you have to set in place, the procedures, if you're building things yourself, if you're going out to contract manufacturers, all that stuff requires some sort of framework around it. And it doesn't have to be a heavy framework, but you have to think about the implications behind those things and what you have to do. So manufacturing is a big thing with hardware. I could probably give like a 2-hour talk on everything we've learned about manufacturing. So I'll just kind of hit on a few things. But designing your product for manufacturing and for someone else being able to test it is a big task. It's completely different, and it's something that you have to think about early and often. From a hardware perspective, that's probably one of the most critical things, is that how do I design for manufacture and test to scale? One of the things we did with FieldKit, and it sort of like, we thought about FieldKit differently as we were building it, was we were building everything ourselves. We actually bought a pick and place machine. We had it in the lab. We were running our own line, which was great to be able to like learn from. But we did that for way too long. There are people who are better at building things than we could ever be. And so like we ended up like exploring that a little bit. And the first contract manufacturer we went to was a brand new contract manufacturer who was setting up his line. And then the second one we went to was an existing technology company. It was actually Cellular Tracking Technologies, which some of you may have heard of. They had downtime on their line, so they built boards for us during that sort of downtime. And then finally, we sort of graduated to like an actual official contract manufacturer for the things that we did. We also made some mistakes along the way. As you're building these things, there's companies that create like little like OEM modules and stuff. And just to give you an example of one of those mistakes is when we originally built FieldKit, we built using water quality circuits that were created by another manufacturer. And as we were testing those circuits, we started to find that they weren't holding calibration in times we wanted to. We were having a lot of data quality problems, and we'd ask them technical questions, and they weren't able to answer our technical questions, and that made me completely lose confidence in that company. But what that meant for us logistically was we had to redesign all these water circuits from scratch. And that was a huge effort. That was a huge effort in the engineering. It probably took us just under 2 years. Huge effort in the engineering, huge effort in the validation. We had to build a bunch of them. We had to run them, test them against known stuff, make sure everything performed the way we wanted for a long time before we ever felt like we were ready to sell them. But the amazing thing now is we have these really great water circuits that are now open source, and other folks can use them if they want to as well. But it was a mistake that really bit us, and it was an issue from a budget perspective as well. The next sort of phase that you sort of have to think about is like, how do you scale the users? This is a completely different thing to think about. There's a lot of stuff that really needs to be in place to be able to meet that sort of thing. So, one of the very easy things to think about is documentation. Documentation is critically important. It's very different depending on what you're building or where you're working. The other side of things is support. We made certain decisions along the process. Originally, we had a e-commerce shop on the FieldKit website, so anyone could go and buy a FieldKit. We took that down because we were afraid for 10,000 FieldKits being owned by 10,000 different people who are all doing 10,000 crazy things with it. And what that means for your support load, when people come in with emails and calls asking you how to fix this stuff, it could completely kill your organization. So we started to think a lot about like, okay, we have this technology, we wanted to do all these things. Not only what does it look like in the next few years, but like what could FieldKit look like in 10 years, in 20 years, and what would that user base look like? And how do we build the tools and include the sort of documentation and information that can support those efforts as they grow and expand in the future? So we've done a huge amount of work around documentation. I still don't think it's enough. We've written a ton of documentation. People don't like to read giant volumes of technical documentation. I don't know if that's a surprise to anyone in here. And one thing that we found along the path, which is really interesting, is that depending on where we're at in different parts of the world, that documentation has to look very different. So we have a project in the Congo Basin, and the way that we have to share the information through that project is, they have to be these really short, like succinct videos that can be shared from phone to phone. That's the only way you'll get people to actually pay attention to it. You can't give them a big document or give them anything like that. And so we found that from place to place that varies a lot. And that really comes at that first point that I was making about knowing your user. But you really have to like listen to them and figure out what they want to build. With FieldKit, our mission as a nonprofit means that we even think beyond that as like, how do we do trainings about like calibration theory and all this sort of stuff. And so we try and do that a lot. We do a lot of public speaking at events trying to share this information. But the way that your documentation, the way that your services look, all that stuff is very much tied to who your users are and what you're trying to do. And so the last sort of big thing from a phase standpoint is the go-to-market and sort of the messaging and sustainability side of it. There's so much information about this stuff online, and a lot of it doesn't necessarily apply. We had an idea of what our business model was, but we didn't think very deeply about it. And in the beginning of last year, we brought on some folks to help us think about it that used to be at the design thinking company IDEO, and we talked a lot about different opportunities. What is the market size of conservation technology, which is not huge, and like what are things that we could do that still could meet the things that where we wanted FieldKit to go. And the big caveat there is that we are a nonprofit. Our mission is core to everything that we do, so everything has to serve the mission. We can't be a giant ag tech company, right? So we have to make choices that are appropriate for that sort of stuff. But there's a lot of different models there. I'll put a giant chart on, but don't worry. I'm at the end of this this presentation. I have a QR code that has these slides, so you can download them and look at them at your own in your own time. But there's a lot of different options out there. The first thing you kind of have to do is understand your market. In the broader sort of technology industry, there's this concept that people call TAM, SAM, SOM. And that's what this is. It's sort of, what's this, your total addressable market? This is the giant market. What is your serviceable addressable market? So this tends to kind of be a bit smaller. It's sort of, in the future, who's everybody that you can kind of serve? And then the last is who's your serviceable attainable market. The thing about doing this is it could be a huge waste of time if you do it incorrectly. And really, you have to think about what you need to get out of it. We didn't do this full exercise. We didn't do TAM, SAM, SOM. We did a lightweight, bottom-up sort of SOM where we were thinking about, what we want to do, who we want to serve. It's important to think about SOM in a way where, like, this isn't everybody who could buy a FieldKit. It's really limited by our own operations. So it's everyone that we could sell a FieldKit to and still kind of continue to survive. But the good thing about it is that it makes you, again, think about your users and also think about your messaging and the things that you're talking about when you're talking about the stuff that you do. That messaging and the value proposition, and we saw in the plenary today the business model canvas. A lot of this information's on that as well. It's really important, and it's how other folks can understand what makes your solution different, and inform like how you should talk about it with them, what your website looks like, all that sort of stuff. Like the exercise that we went to with this actually caused us to completely change our branding and our website, because it was no longer sort of this big solution that was supposed to serve everything from field scientists to education. We were much more targeted in who we were trying to serve and the way that we were going to do that. And so we went through a big effort around it. And that's sort of what these sort of things are supposed to do, is help inform you about how you talk about the stuff that you do. Okay, this is the giant business model chart. There's a lot of different business models out there. You could find a bunch of this information online. There's no one good option, and a lot of times folks do multiple sort of pieces of it to find a path to sustainability. But there's different ways you can structure your organization and approach money. But I think it's important to think about the work that you do and what you're building and how it goes beyond conservation, because the reality is that conservation is not a huge market, and there's not a ton of money. People don't come into this because they want to get rich, you know? So if there's ways that you can, the data you create, the hardware you create, can serve things outside, you can have actually a lot of impact. And I mean, a great example of that is, you know, camera traps, right? Camera traps are not built for conservationists. They're a fundamental tool for conservationists. If we were building our own camera traps, they would not be the price point that they are, you know? And that would make them much harder to use. So at FieldKit, we're kind of doing a hybrid of stuff, and we're testing out these different ideas. We've been doing this for a while now. Those where the logo is next to are the 4 different things that we've been testing out. One is hardware sales. I've talked about that a fair amount. But we've also just sort of changed the way we think about hardware sales. Like, I personally would much rather sell a bunch of FieldKits to one customer than a ton of FieldKits to a ton of customers. So that impacts the way that I talk about FieldKit, where I go and present about it, who I call to try and buy them, things like that. We've also been working with this idea around maintenance and service contracts. This year, we're doing some work with some field stations. We piloted it with some other field stations, but like how we can use FieldKit as sort of sensor infrastructure in a field station, how we support them and work with them, and that's a project that we're developing this year. The field school program, it turns out we were doing this just to help the folks who are using FieldKit, and there's a bunch of people who would like to do it just more broadly, so we've started to do training programs and things like that. And then lastly, we do custom engineering projects. So people who either want to have a sensor module that doesn't exist, we help them build that, or they want to, like the project with New York, where they want to use some of our other capabilities, our data visualization stuff, but so we will do like custom deployments of our stuff. So, you know, that's us like trying to explore what sort of options are out there. Do I think that we're going to be doing all of that stuff in 5 years? Probably not. But you have to realize that like each one of those ideas, each one of those business models requires different types of people, right? If we're doing support and maintenance services, that's a different team than just hardware sales. And so you kind of have to think about how do you develop that, how do you build that stuff out. One of the problems with conservation technology, too, is just the funding structure. A lot of times we get grants to build, like they're project-based grants, and it's like, oh, build this new shiny thing, or add this new feature, or do it in this different area that you didn't work before, which are great and they're fun, but it's not an easy way to build something that kind of can take this pathway and grow and scale. And so you just kind of got to think about that as you're going through funding. I know it's hard. I mean, I've chased shiny things for years, so I understand how that goes. But that's a difficult way to scale out. Last thing I'll say is I'm a huge open source evangelist, so you know, I was on the board of the Open Source Hardware Association for a long time. I think it's a great way to scale. I won't go too much into it. I will say that, you know, there's a lot to consider when you're doing that. There's certainly a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it. And it mostly lies in building sort of the tool and community around that to help take you there. Last thing, I do want to give a special shout out to AudioMoth. I think AudioMoth is a fantastic example of impact in our industry. They've been very thoughtful about scope creep and bringing in support and stuff like that they haven't had. I think we can learn a lot from it. I mean, you know, a lot of folks, if we built AudioMoth, we'd be trying to like, oh, let's do edge work, let's do this, and like the scope would constantly grow. They decided not to do that, and they've sold a lot of AudioMoths, and they are, you know, sitting on a nice amount of money, and they just decide not to grow the company, keep it as it is, and I think that's a nice example for us to think about as we think about, you know, conservation tech moving forward. And lastly, I just want to give a deep thanks to all our partners and the indigenous communities that we've been able to work with. We're deeply, deeply, deeply grateful to be able to put our tools in these really amazing places. So as I said, here are the charts. I'll leave this up so you can take a picture and you can download it. But you know, feel free to email me or contact me if you want to talk or if you have any thoughts about this. I'm always happy to share everything we do. Once we kind of get through our whole process around our business model, all that information I'm also going to publish online, open for anyone to explore and learn from. So you know, I don't know what time that will come out, but I just want to put it out there so folks know. Great, thank you.